Hello and welcome to RBTV Episode 2. I'm your host, George Bonish. For those of you who've never tuned in before, RBTV is a video podcast covering some of the latest tips and tricks for the RealBasic development environment. Alright guys, so Real World Conference is coming up soon. For those of you who are going, tell everybody there about RBTV. Spread the word. You know, get the site URL out there and tell everybody about it so we can make this thing as big as possible. So on today's episode, we're going to be making a cool little program using some more of the built-in controls and functions and objects that RealBasic offers. For those of you who didn't watch episode 1, and if you're a beginner, I'd recommend going back and watching that if you can, to get some of the basics in, because I'm going to be using a lot of what we covered in episode 1 in today's episode. What we're going to be doing is making a little contact application. So, you know, let's say you had a client or you had somebody that you wanted to get some personal information about, you know, like their name and their address, maybe, you know, what gender they are, their age, or whatever. We're going to make a small little program that they can fill out that information, and it'll email you a copy of everything they fill in. So let's go ahead and get started. If you have RealBasic installed, go ahead and open it up and start a new project. And this should be the first window you see. And in episode 1 we covered the GUI of RealBasic, so you should be pretty familiar with it. If not, like I said, go back and watch episode 1 again, and you should get pretty familiar with that. And we're going to cover some more stuff in today's episode. So the first thing we're going to want to do is rename window 1 here to something a little bit more, you know, to our liking. So go ahead and go over to your property value pane here and make sure window 1 is selected, and let's change name to Win Main. And if you remember from episode 1, we talked about naming schemes and how, you know, naming things according to what kind of control or object they are. So in this case it's a window, so I put Win and then kind of a description of what the window is. So it's the main window. So you can kind of figure out if you're referring to this object within the code. It makes it a lot easier to refer to it. So go ahead and hit return to set that property, and let's go ahead and double click on window main and open it up here. And again, we have our three kind of paned window here: our design pane in the middle, our control pane on the left, and our property value pane on the right. So the next thing we want to do, let's go ahead and size our window to how we're going to want it for the application. And for our case today, I figured out that a pretty good size would be 460 by 310. So again, you have two ways of doing that. You can either grab these disclosure boxes here and drag, but an easier way to do that would just come over here to the property value pane, and we're going to set our width to 460, and we can hit return to set that, and then our height to 310, and hit return again. So that's set now, and that's a pretty good size. One thing we want to do before actually we start is go ahead and save the project. So I'm going to go up to File and Save, and I'm going to name this episode 2 and hit save. Now it's really important to always save, because, you know, I've had situations where I've done 2 hours of work, I got so into the coding that I forgot to save, and, you know, the computer died or RealBasic crashed or whatever, and I lost all that work. So save frequently. It's really important that you guys do that. So now that we have this saved, let's go ahead and come back here to window 1, and you'll see the title here is untitled. Let's go ahead and change that to something our user will like a bit more. So come over here to the property value pane and to the title property, and again, the title property is what's referenced right up here. So we want to select title here and change it to, let's see, contact form. How does that sound? And hit return to set that, and you'll see it's referenced right up here. So let's save this. Let's go ahead and run it just to make sure we know what everything's going to look like. So you see we have our window here, no resize box, and no resizing handle here, and our title is contact form. Let's go ahead and quit that, and that's good for now. So the first thing we're going to add to the window, this is a new control that we haven't talked about, and what it is, it's a page panel control. And you'll see it right here. What a page panel is imagine like a notebook, like a spiral notebook. You have different pages that you can add controls to or objects to or whatever, and you can control which page the user sees. It's much like a tabbed interface like this. You can imagine like this square right here would be a page panel, you know, of let's say 1, and this would be a page panel 2. So page 1 here, page 2 here. So basically it lets you switch between, you know, controls or objects without having to make separate windows. So let's go ahead and add a page panel to the window. We're going to double click on that, and you'll see it'll add here. And go ahead and drag it to the top, all the way to the top. Now you're going to see this gray area here and this control at the bottom of the page panel. When you run the application, you're not going to see any of that. This is strictly for designing purposes and to help you navigate through the page panel when you're writing the application. So go ahead and drag it to the top left there and click on it, and let's resize it to the width of the window, and right about here. So I'd say 460 by 260 would be a pretty good size. And hit return to save that. Now you remember again from last episode that when we add an object, we want to remember to lock it to the sides of the window. So in this case, we're going to want the page panel to scale with the window. Even though the user is not going to be able to resize it, we still want to go ahead and do that. So make sure your page panel is selected, and let's go ahead and lock it to every side. Alright, so that's done there. Now let's go ahead and rename this to something that we can refer to. So let's do PGP for page panel, and let's do main, and we can set that and save. So now you can see the page panel here is on our window, but when we run the application, you see you can't see it anywhere, and it doesn't affect anything if I click in here. So it's really an invisible control that we're going to be controlling using code. So go ahead and quit the application. Now let me explain a little bit about the page panel here. You'll notice the number 0 here. This number is the what's called the index of the page panel. This is like the page, basically, the currently selected page. And then you'll notice these two left and right arrows here and this drop down arrow here. Now the left and right arrow here will navigate between pages, and this drop down here allows you to just select a page. So if you have 100 pages, you know, it's much easier to select it through here than using these left and right arrows. So let me show you a little bit about exactly what a page will do. I'm just gonna go ahead and add some static text here. You don't need to do any of this. I'm just gonna show you this to explain to you how it works. So I'm gonna double click on some static text here and add it to page panel page 0 here. And you'll notice I switched to page 1. I'm gonna add it here. So you can see when I switch between the two, you'll notice it's the two static text objects. But when I run the program, you're going to see what's on page 0, which is the first page. And right now we don't have any controls to switch the pages or anything, so you're only going to be seeing what's on page 0. So let's quit that. I'm going to go ahead and delete these. So now you know a little bit about how a page panel works. There's lots of properties you can mess with here, but for now, you know, just know the basics of it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is add a header, you know, to each page, so the user knows what to do on each page. So the first page, what we're going to do is have a little contact information, you know, their first name, last name, street address, you know, phone number, whatever. So let's go ahead and add some static text to the page again. I'm going to drag it to right here to the top left. Now we're going to have this be a little bit bigger so it looks, you know, more pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to resize this text box right here, right about that big. So you'll notice again, you can always look over here on the width and the height to see what I set the sizes to. So I'm going to do the height to about 30. Alright, so the text is still small. So what we're going to want to do is change the size of the text right here. And you'll notice text font and text size. Now I'm going to keep the text font to system because system is whatever operating system they're using, what the default font would be. So I'm just going to change the text size here to about 18. Well, let's do it about maybe, let's see, 25. 25 looks about good. And let's go ahead and bold that. So now you'll see it's a nice header there. Let's see, actually I'm going to make this probably around, let's see, 23. 23 looks good. So we still have untitled here. So let's go ahead and change this to what we're going to have our first page being. So in this case we're going to have it being the contact information. So make sure this text right here is selected, and come over here to the text value or text property, and we're going to go ahead and click on this little ellipses button here so that we can see the full value of the text, and we're going to change it to contact information and hit the OK button. You notice it changes right there. Alright, so we can go ahead and save that, and let's run it just to make sure we know what that looks like on the page. Alright, and you can see that we don't see the page panel again, but our static text shows up right there perfectly. So that's good. Let's go ahead and quit that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to show you guys is what's called a separator. And a separator serves really no purpose except you know, visually separating objects or whatever. So you'll notice you see the separator right here. It's just the little line. Let's go ahead and double click that, and it'll add a separator to our page here. Okay, one thing to note, you'll notice this big red box around our page panel. What this means, it's an embedding box. So if you have a control on your page, you can embed it within another object. So you notice when I drag the separator outside the page panel, the red box goes away and I can release it. But if I drag the separator back into the box and the red box, the embedding box comes around it, you'll notice that when I move the page panel, all the objects that are embedded within it move along with it. So that makes it really handy. But you'll notice also if I drag this contact information over here slightly off, while it's still on the page panel, you'll notice that the red box didn't show up when I dropped it. So it's not embedded within it. So it's not going to move along with it. So we want to make sure that we embed that and make sure all our objects are embedded correctly. So with our separator here, let's go ahead and drag this right up underneath here, and you'll notice we can embed the separator within the static text object as well, but we're not going to want to do that. Let's just drag it right about here, and these resizing handles are a bit hard to grab, so I'm going to go ahead and just use our resizing width right here. Let's see, what was our window width? 460. So let's go ahead and make this width of about 440. You noticed that scaled across, and it's a pretty good width there. And let's go ahead and lock this to the left and to the right and to the top. That way if the window does get resized, this will scale accordingly. And we're going to want to do the same thing with our static text here. We're going to want to do the left and the top and the right. And let's save that. So this looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and fix some of the positioning here so that it kind of lines up a bit more with the page. And let's save that. So now we have our static text and our separator on top of a page panel on top of our window main here. And I'm going to go ahead and run this to show you. You'll see our separator there. looks good underneath our static text, and again you can't see the page panel. So let's go ahead and quit this. So now before we add any controls here, we're going to go ahead and do the next page. We're going to go ahead and add the title into the next page. So what we're going to want to do is copy these two controls, so you can control click or command click both of these two to select both of them. I'm going to go up to edit and copy. I'm going to flip over to page 1 here, and I'm going to go up to edit and paste and move it right about where the other one was. So we can do it just like that. You notice if we switch between the two, they're a little bit off, so let's go ahead and fix that. And you'll notice now when we switch between the two pages, you can't tell a difference. So they're positioned correctly. But we're going to want to change the heading of page 2 here to whatever we're going to have on page 2. Well, I say page 2, but it's actually page 1 or index 1. So select the static text up here, and again go to the text property there, and let's go ahead and highlight that, and let's change this to personal information. So on this page we're going to have the more personal information, the email address, the age, gender, any comments the user wants to submit, and they can do that. So now that we have that, deselect your static text up there and save that. So you can see now we have contact information and personal information. So we have these two pages. Let's go ahead and switch back to contact information here, and let's add our edit fields so that the user can input all the data that they need, or that we need from them. So the first thing we're going to want is a first name and a last name edit field. Now I'm going to separate these two because it's going to make it easier if we want to use the data later on. So let's go ahead and find the edit field control up here, and we used the edit field control in the last project, or in the last episode. So if you're not familiar with this, go ahead and check that out in episode 1. You notice it looks just like this. So let's go ahead and double click this once, and let's drag it right about here. Line it up. Again, our object is going to snap to the grid, our control is going to snap to grid depending on what RealBasic thinks is appropriate. So we're going to go ahead and drop it there. And let's add some static text as well so that the user knows what they want to enter or what they need to enter here. So we can come down to static text right here and double click that. You'll notice our static text pops up within our page panel. Let's go ahead and drag that right up here on top of the edit field. And let's rename the text in here to first name. So we want the user to know that they're going to input the first name right there. So we're going to make sure our static text is selected and come over to the text property here and click there and do first name and hit return to set that property. And you'll notice that our static text changed here on the window. So let's go ahead, I'm going to fix the positioning here a bit. Let's go ahead and give the user a little bit more space to put in their first name. So make sure your edit field here is selected, and let's drag it out right about here, I'd say. Okay, so we have the first name edit field here, and the first name is static text. So we're going to want to do a last name edit field right next to it. So what we can do one of two things. We can either double click on the static text again and edit field again, or we can just copy and paste these two controls right here, and that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to command click or control click both of these and copy them and paste them. Just drag it right next to it right there, and make sure that these two controls, these two and these two, line up vertically so that they look appropriate on the program. And we're going to go ahead and change the static text here to say last name and hit that to set the property. Let's go ahead and save. So now we have these two edit fields here, but you'll notice that they're still named edit field 1 and edit field 2. So that's bad. We're not going to be able to reference them easily within the program. So let's go ahead and change those to the field that they actually are. So in this case, we're going to change it to field first name, and this one's going to be field last name, and set that property. So now it's going to be a lot easier for us when we start getting into the code to be able to retrieve the text that's within each of these edit fields. So I'm going to save this. Let's go ahead and run it just to show you what's going on. And you'll see now we have first name, we have last name, and we can type in here, and we can actually tab between the two using the tab key. RealBasic sets that up for us. So right now there's no code going on. We just have a an interface setting up. But that's all we're going to be doing right now. So go ahead and quit this and come back to our design pane here. We're going to want to add about 7 more edit fields in here. So I'm just going to copy and paste all these just like that. Now this one's going to be we're going to want to make this the street address. So we're going to go ahead, since people's street addresses are generally, they could be longer, they could be shorter, we're going to want to have this a pretty long edit field. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one and stretch it all the way across the window, right about there. And we're going to change this static text to street address and hit enter or return to set that. And then we're going to change this edit field here to field street address and return. Now it's key to name your controls appropriately, because I can't tell you how annoying it is to have to switch back to your design pane to try and figure out what object or what control you're trying to reference. So the next edit field we're going to want to add is the city, state, and zip edit fields. So I'm going to go ahead and paste these back in here. I still have the first name edit field copied, and I'm going to go ahead and place this one here, and this one's going to be our city edit field. So I'm going to go ahead and make this right about 185 width, and we're going to change this to city. And then we're going to have another one in here for the state. Now we could use a little drop down with the list of all the states in it, but for this episode that's a bit too complicated, and I'm not going to cover that. So I'm just going to have the user enter in their state right here, the state abbreviation. So we're going to change this static text here to state. Okay, and I'm going to resize this a little bit so that it doesn't interfere with any of our other objects. And then the last field we're going to do, or the last one on this row, is going to be our zip code. Our zip code field. And for those of you who live outside the United States, probably you have postal codes or whatever. But in this case, we're gonna make it right about there and change our static text there to zip. Alright, so we're going to want to go back and change all these edit field names to reflect what they actually are. So we're going to do field city, we'll do field state, and then for the last one, field zip, and return and save. Alright, final row now. We're gonna ask for their home phone and their work phone. So again, I'm just gonna paste these two controls right here and change this to let's see, home phone, and this to work phone. And we're going to change the edit fields here to field home phone and field work phone. Alright, so this looks pretty good. We have our contact information here, and we've set all these static text titles appropriately, and we've named all of our fields. So this is going to make it really, really easy for us when we do a step later on in the project to reference the data that's within these fields. So again, I'm going to go ahead and save that and run it just to show you what we have on the page right now. So we have all the edit fields that we created, and we can tab through each one, and the user can enter in the data, hello world 123 Lane, and then Austin, Texas, and we can enter in whatever we want in here. But again, this is only an interface right now, so this does absolutely nothing for us right now. But at least the user can enter in the data, and that's what we want. So let's go ahead and quit this application, and let's switch to page 1 over here, or page 2 of our designing. And we're going to go ahead and create the fields here for the personal information. What we're going to request on this page is the email address, the user's age, their gender, their annual income, and we're going to have a big edit field, a multi-line edit field here at the bottom for them to enter in some comments if they want to. So we still have the edit field and static text from the previous page over here copied on the clipboard. So we can go ahead and paste that right here. You'll notice it'll paste within the page panel there. And people's email address lengths can vary, so we're going to want to do the same thing that we did with our address field, and make this the length of the page or of the window, so that they have more than enough room to enter in their information. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this right out there, and you'll notice the positioning here doesn't line up with this one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and move these two up just a bit. Maybe a little bit more, and you'll notice they line up perfectly now. And that's really important to make sure things line up appropriately. Having a uniform look throughout your program is very important, because otherwise users get really confused on where they need to go next within the program. So let's go ahead and change the static text right here to let's see, email. Now you'll notice I'm not changing the names of the static text in this case, in this project, because we're not really going to be referencing them, so it's not that important to do it. You can, and it's probably a good habit to do it, and to name this maybe text first name, text last name, text street address. But since we're not going to be actually referencing these objects or these controls, we're not going to do it within this project. So let's go ahead and rename our edit field here to field email, and that looks pretty good, so let's save that. Now I'm going to introduce a new control to you guys. It's the RadioButton control. What a RadioButton is, if you have a list, they're almost like bullets that you can select. You can have a list of anything pretty much. An user can select, one of the objects in the list, and the little radio button will be selected. So I can go ahead and show that to you right now, and you'll notice the radio button control here in our control pane. Let's go ahead and double click on this, and it'll add one to our page there. Let's go ahead and position it right about here. I may be moving that a little bit later. And let's go ahead and add another one. Now these are going to automatically get linked together, so one of them is going to be enabled by default. We're going to go ahead and set that, and then when the user clicks on the other one, it's going to automatically deselect the enabled one and select the other one. So by default we're going to have the first one enabled. So again, like every other control, the radio button control has set of properties and values, and you'll notice that it has the value property here under the initial state, and this is the actual selected property. So when this has a check in it, this radio button is going to be selected, and if you watch right here, when I select this value right here, a checkbox or a bullet's going to be inserted right there. You'll see just like that I can enable it or disable it. So this first one is going to be the one we're going to want to have selected by default, and it can be the second one, either one, it doesn't matter. And this is going to be our gender section right here. So we're going to have a male and a female radio button. So we're going to want to rename this, and just like most controls with text in them, it has a caption or a title property, and in this case it's labeled caption, and you'll see it says untitled, as it says untitled here. So we're going to want to change this to male, and hit return. And you'll notice it changed to male right here on our page. And the second one here, we're going to want to do female and hit return and make sure we save the project. So now you'll notice there's a big gap right here between the two, and we don't really want that because it's pretty much wasting our space. So let's go ahead and resize this just a bit. This looks pretty good, and let's go ahead and drag this over, and you'll notice it pops to it snaps to the grid there to an appropriate spacing. So now we have male and female radio buttons here. Let's go ahead and add some static text right above it that says gender, so the user knows what they need to select. So let's go ahead and double click static text right there, and you notice it gets added to the window. And let's go ahead and position it right above these radio buttons. Now let's change the text on there to gender. Alright, okay, that looks pretty good right there. The next thing we're going to want to add is the age field. We're going to want to allow the user to enter in their age, so that we can see that information. And we're going to go ahead and add it right here next to the email field. Now I made this a little bit too big, so let's click here and maybe resize it right about there. And we're going to add 3 controls for the age field here, and one of those is going to be a new control. But the first thing we're going to want to do, let's copy these 2 right here and drag it right here and resize this edit field. Since the age is going to be relatively small as far as the width of the text is, this can be a pretty small edit field. So let's go ahead and change the static text here to say age. So let's go ahead and rename this edit field here to let's say field age, and set that. So now the new control I'm going to be introducing to you is called the up-down arrow control, and what that is, it's usually used to raise or lower the value of a number or an integer. In this case, we're going to allow the user to click the up or down arrows to raise or lower the number that's going to be displayed here in the age box, in the age edit field. So go ahead and locate the up down arrow control, and it looks like this. Right here you see the little small up and down arrows. Let's double click that, and let's position it right next to our edit field right there. That looks pretty good. Now right now this doesn't do anything. We're going to have to write some code to actually change the value of this edit field right here. But for now we're just going to be designing the look of our program. So let's make sure we position that correctly. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and select these, maybe drag it over just a bit so that this lines up right there, and maybe resize this. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, the next control we're going to be adding, or the next object we're going to be adding is our income object. And then for that, again, we're going to be using another new control, and for that we're going to be using the pop-up menu. So first of all, let's go ahead and add some static text right in here. We can double click on the static text control there in our control pane, and let's go ahead and position it right about here. Let's name it income, or let's change the text to income, and locate your pop-up menu control, which looks just like this, and double click it to add it to the window, and position it right underneath your static text there. And we're going to go ahead and make it about this big. Let's see, right about there. So maybe about 236, 235, really depending on where everything's positioned. And maybe drop it down a couple so it doesn't interfere with our static text right there. And maybe do the same with these two so they line up. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So again, right now we're not going to worry about adding anything into this, any data into this pop-up menu right now. We're just going to be positioning where we want it. And so the last field on this personal information page is going to be our comments field, and that's going to take up this big blank space right here. That's going to be where the user can enter in any additional comments they may have, or anything you're going to want them to put in. So let's go ahead and add some or actually we have copied already an edit field from our previous selection, so we can go ahead and paste that in here. And let's go ahead and maybe change this to comments, and let's resize this so that the user has more than one line to enter in data on. And if you remember from episode 1, there's a difference between a single line and a multi-line edit field, and each edit field contains a multi-line property. So go ahead and make sure this edit field is selected, and come over here to the property value pane and locate the multi-line property, and go ahead and check that, and you'll notice our vertical scroll bar appears right here. And now the user can enter in as much data as they need to, and we can get that data later on. That'll be good. So go ahead and save this, and we forgot to name a couple of the controls up here, so let's go ahead and do that. Our radio button here, it's still titled Radio Button 1 and Radio Button 2, so let's select the first one here and do rad male. Let's do rad female. And this is going to be a pop-up menu, so how about pop income, and then our comments field here we're going to have to change to field comments, and hit return to set that property. I believe we named these two. The up-down arrow we really don't need to worry about, since we're not going to be getting any data from it, so you can just keep that as up-down arrow. And let's go ahead and save. So now, even though our personal information page is selected, when I run the program, or when I debug the program, our contact information is still going to be the first page it's going to be displayed, since it's 0, or the first index within the page panel. So let me just show you how that's going to work. Go ahead and save the project, and we can go ahead and select index 1 here on the page panel and hit the debug button. And you'll notice our contact information is displayed, and we can't switch to our personal information just yet, so that's what our next step is going to be to do. So let's go ahead and quit this and return to our main window here. Let's go ahead and switch this over to 1, or over to 0. Now I'm going to introduce a couple, or actually one new control here. It's titled the Bevel Button, and the Bevel Button is very, very similar to the push button control from that we learned in episode 1, except it looks just a bit different. It's more squared off, and for our case it's gonna look a bit better, and that's right at the top of your control list here. And we're gonna want two of those. We're gonna have a back button and a next button. Let's go ahead and double click to add one and position it right about here, and double click to add another one. Let's go ahead and put it right here on this side. Okay, so to talk about bevel buttons here. You'll see they have untitled. Like most things, they contain a text or a caption. You'll notice it right here. We can change the caption of these. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's change this one to back and select this over to next. And changing the caption doesn't allow us to do anything yet. It's just changing what the user sees. So if we run the program and click these two buttons, they're still not going to do anything because they don't have any code, and then basically they're dumb buttons. We need to basically teach them what to do. And you'll notice there's a lot of if we resize the property value pane here, there's a lot of properties that you can mess around with a bevel button. You can change the alignment of the text within the bevel button there, the placement, everything. So go ahead and play around with this and see what you like. You can even change the type of bevel it is. You'll notice when I clicked on that, it changed the way that this looks. You do large bevel. There's lots of different options you could play with, but for now I'm going to change it back to normal bevel, just like, or change it back to small bevel, just like our back button over here. Let's go ahead and bring this back over. So let's go ahead and save this project, and I'm going to run it just to show you that these buttons don't do anything yet. You'll see when you click the next button, click the back button, they really don't do anything yet. So let's go ahead and quit this. Now let's start to teach these buttons what to do. Actually, before that, you notice kind of there's a bigger gap right here on the right side of our window as opposed to our left side here, and little things like that tend to bother people and bother myself. So let's go ahead and fix that space. I'm going to drag this right over here and align it with our button, the right side of our button there. Maybe make this a bit bigger. Let's see, maybe move this over just a bit, make this a bit bigger, and we can move this one over just a bit as well. Alright, that looks a bit better. Let's go ahead and save that, and maybe we can do the same thing. This one seems to be pretty aligned. Maybe we can fix these and adjust these. Now, like I was saying, it's really important to make sure that the interface is pretty uniform, because that's really what makes a quality application, is not only the way it runs but the way it looks. And if you have a really badly built GUI, the user is really not going to want to use your program. They're probably going to switch to something that's a bit easier on the eyes. So when you have something that's really clean and good looking, then that makes it really good for the user. So let's switch back to page 0 here on our page panel. I'm going to go ahead and save the project so all our changes get saved. So this back button here, what we're going to want to do is change the value of this page panel right here. So we're going to want to take it back 1 from whatever it is. So if this is on, let's say 1 here, we're going to want our back button to change this back to 0, right? So it switches, back 1 page. And our next button is going to want to do the exact opposite. We're going to want to increment it to the next page. So basically this is our decrement, this is going to be our increment. So the first thing we're going to do, double click on our back button here, our bevel button, and you'll notice we didn't name these bevel buttons, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to switch back to our window main tab up the top there and select this bevel button. Now let's do BVL for bevel and then back. Let's do this one as BVL next. Okay, that's good. So now let's go ahead and double click on the back button here. You notice it takes us to the action method of the back button. The action method, if you didn't watch episode 1, is what's called whenever the user clicks on the button. So whenever the user clicks on the button, basically any code that's within here is going to be run. And what we're going to want the code to do is set or decrement this value right here. And this value right here on a page panel is the value property. That's the name of the property. So to reference this number, it's going to be PGPMain.value. So let's switch back to our back button here. And what we're going to want to do is reference again that page panel. We're going to want to reference the value property of the page panel. So let's do PGPMain, and again you'll see it autocomplete, so we can hit tab there, and the dot operator will access all the properties that page panel main contain. Then we're going to want to again access the value property. Okay, so we're going to want to decrement the page panel main value by 1. So we're going to want to set it basically to 1 less than it is currently. So we're going to do page panel main.value equals, and then we're going to access the current value, and then we're going to do -1. So if our page panel value was 1, we're going to subtract 1 from it, and we're going to set it to 0. And by setting this value, it actually changes the page. So if it was at 1, we just changed the page back to 0, so we returned back to our contact information. So basically if we were like this and we push the back button, it would change it back to our contact information. So let's go ahead and save this, and we can close this tab. Let's go ahead and switch to the next button here, and we're going to want to do the exact same thing that we did on our bevel back button here, except we're going to want to increment it. So we can go ahead and copy this code here and switch back to the action method of bevel next, paste that in there, but we can change this minus sign to a plus sign, so we're incrementing our values here. Let's go ahead and save that. So one thing to kind of note on is something called comments. Now, it's really good practice to comment all of your code. And what a comment is basically, just a little note to yourself explaining what you're doing within the code. And it's really good when you're learning, because if you need to go back and reference some code, you can really figure out what was going on, or what your thought process was when you were actually writing the code. And generally you're going to want to have the comment right above the code that you're writing. So let's go ahead and add a couple comments in here, and in our bevel back button, let's go ahead and drop this down one line, and you'll notice our comment button right here. We can go ahead and click that, and it'll add a little apostrophe right there. Now there's two ways to do a comment. You can either do an apostrophe, or you can do double forward slashes like that, and that'll also make a comment. And you'll notice that the color changed to red, or a red tone, and that red tone implicates a comment. So we can go ahead and delete those two, and let's go ahead and write, let's see, we're on bevel next, so this is going to increment PGP main. Okay, and you'll see it's red, and that's really helpful for us. So if we need to come back and reference this piece of code later, we know exactly what it's doing without even having to read the code. So let's go ahead and go to bevel back here and do the same thing right above this. Let's do decrement PGP main and save that. So it's something really doesn't take much time at all to do. And it's really good to do it while you're writing the code, because once you get done with the program, you're gonna most people, they just don't even bother writing the comments, but it's really good practice to do it as you're writing the code. So we can go ahead and close this tab right here, and I'm going to show you the code that we just did. So right now we wrote code in our back button here to decrement page panel here, and we wrote our code in the next button that's going to increment the value of page panel. So let's go ahead and save this, and we can test it out, and you'll see that our button's displayed there nicely, and we can switch to the next field, or the next page within our page panel, and you'll see all our data is located there. We can have any data we want here, but you'll notice that this button doesn't work yet, and nothing is contained within our drop-down. But if you take a look at our radio buttons here, you'll notice that they automatically switch whenever I select one or the other. And that's a great feature of RealBasic, that it's it's smart enough that it knows to link these two together. And again, the user can select here and type in a comment. So one problem that we're going to have here is with these two buttons. You'll notice we're at the end of our page here. We only have 2 pages, but the user can still click the next button, and basically we don't want that to be available. We want to disable this when it's at the last page, and enable it when there's still more pages to go. And the same with this back button. When you get to the very first page, we're going to want this to be disabled, because you'll notice we're at page 0 right now. We're at value 0, but when I click this back button, it switches to value 1, and that's going to confuse people. So we're going to want to basically put in a little fail-safe on these two that say if the value of this is 0, then we're going to want to disable this button, and if the value is 1, then we're going to want to disable this button. So let's go ahead and quit this. The program looks pretty good so far as the design goes. So we're just going to start worrying about our coding. So let's go ahead and quit this, and let's open up our page panel control here. And you notice we get, I'm going to reduce the size right here. You'll notice we get taken into the change method of the page panel main. And the change method gets called anytime the value of the page panel changes. So if you go to a new page, anything that's in here is going to get called. And what we're going to want to do within here is have our fail-safe, so that when the user changes the page, if the value is our maximum value, we're going to want to disable this button, and if it's our minimum value, we're going to want to enable this and disable this. So let's go ahead and do that. And again, remember we renamed these buttons to Bevel Back and Bevel Next, so it makes it really easy to reference them. Okay, so the first step we're going to want to do, each control, to explain a little bit about referencing a control within itself. Each control contains the me value, and what the me value is basically saying, instead of since we're within the PagePanel main here, instead of typing PGP main dot value or whatever, we can simply type me dot value and reference it within ourselves, and it may make execution just a little bit faster, and it makes referencing objects a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and create an if statement here. Let me go ahead and delete this. So to explain to you what we're going to do, we're going to create an if statement that says if me.value is at the maximum value, so if PagePanel main is at its maximum page, we're going to want to disable the next button and make sure our back button is enabled. And if it's at the minimum value or page 0, we're going to want to disable our back button and re-enable our next button. So let's go ahead and write that code. So let's create an if statement here. This says if me.value, and what this is saying is if PagePanel main.value equals 1, so that's going to be our maximum, then, and remember we want to disable our next button, so bevel next dot, and then you remember from episode 1, each object or each control has an enabled property, and we can set that to true, or that's a Boolean property, so we can set that to true or false, and that'll actually enable and disable the control. So we're going to say enabled equals false. So now if the page is on anything except the maximum value, we're obviously going to want the next button to be enabled, right? So the user can switch to the next page. So we can just do else bevel next dot enabled equals true. And let's go ahead and close that if statement out. So now anytime the page changes, this check is called. So it's going to say if we've reached our maximum page, let's go ahead and disable the next button so that the user can't click it anymore. But if we've not reached our maximum page, or if we went back, we can go ahead and re-enable the button. And we're going to want to go ahead and do a check also for our back button. So let's go ahead and write another if statement. Let's do if me.value equals 0, then, so now if we're at our minimum page, or our first page, we're going to want to disable the back button so that the user can't go to any previous page, which in this case wouldn't be any page because we're at our minimum. But you remember how the back button kind of reset it to the very end. I don't know, it really messes things up. So let's go ahead and just disable this back button here. So let's do bevel back dot enabled equals false. And then else, so if we're not at our minimum value, we obviously have some way to go back. We have some space to go back. So let's go ahead and do bevel back dot enabled equals true. And let's end if, and go ahead and save that. So now every time the page changes, these two if statements are going to get called, and it's going to determine what needs to be enabled and what needs to be disabled. So let me go ahead and show you exactly how this works. Oh, and one more thing. Switch back to the design pane of window main. Since the change method of PagePanel isn't called when it's opened up, so when the program is opened up, we're going to be at page 0 by default, and so none of that if statement is going to get checked. So we're going to want to have the back button disabled by default, since we don't want the user to be able to go any further back than 0. So go ahead and select the back button here and locate the enabled property here. You'll notice it's within the appearance set, and let's go ahead and check that to disable it. So save this and go ahead and run it. Okay, so you'll see the user can't click the back button there, But as soon as I click this next button, watch what happens to this back button, and watch what happens to the next button. This should be disabled, and then this should become enabled. Let's go ahead and do that. Oh, there you go, it works perfectly. So you see now the user can't click the next button anymore, but now they can click the back button, which is going to decrement the page panel value. And then as soon as this changes, it's going to call that check, those two if statements that we made within the change method, and it's going to see this, and it's going to disable this and re-enable this. Alright, so everything works pretty much the way we want it to work right now. You know, we can switch back between the two. All our fields work correctly. All our controls. These two don't work yet, and we're going to go ahead and wait just a little bit before we actually do that. But we can go ahead and quit the application. And let's go ahead and save it. Make sure you save it again, because you know, if anything did crash. Alright, the next step to do, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add a page right after this personal information data page here. So we have, you know, let's say we get all their contact information, we get all their personal information, and so that's all the data we're going to want from them. So the next thing we're going to want to do, when they click the next button, we're going to want to send them to basically like a completion page where, you know, it says, you know, thank you for filling out the data, whatever. Click the finish button to you know, to submit it, or whatever you really want to put there. It doesn't matter. But I'm just going to show you how to append a page. Basically, I'm going to show you how to append a page to the end of a page panel here. And to do that, make sure your page panel main is selected there. And come over here to the panels property and go ahead and click on this ellipses button here. And it'll bring up the panel editor window. I mean, you can see our two pages right here, and all these buttons right here. Now let's go ahead and hit the add button, and that's going to append the page right to the end there. And you'll see page 2. And if you wanted to, you know, maybe locate this between page 0 and page 1, you could use these up and down buttons to position it where exactly you want it. But in our case, we're going to want it right at the end. So now that that's done, go ahead and hit OK. And you'll notice when I hit the drop down here, page 2 is displayed. So we can go ahead and select page 2, and that's going to be our blank page. So just like the other pages, let's go ahead and copy and paste that little header data right there, you know, the big text and the separator. So we can go ahead and copy that from right here, if I can select it. Alright, and switch to page 2 there. And let's go ahead and position that how we like it. Okay. It's always tricky trying to get these things lined up correctly. Up one. That should do it. Alright, so now you see there the headers are lined up perfectly right across all of them. And so let's go ahead and change this header here to let's do thank you. So basically we're thanking the user for entering in their data. And we're going to display a big multi-line static text right here telling the user exactly what they need to do. So go ahead and locate the static text control here and double click that. Let's add that to our window here. And I'm going to go ahead and expand it all the way across our window. And you'll notice that the text within it is staying in the middle as far as vertically in the middle of our control. And that's because it's still a single line static text. And like the edit field, static text contains single and multi-line properties. So go ahead and come over here to our appearance property set and make sure the multi-line value is checked. And you'll notice that our text went right to the top. So now it's multi-line. So now if I were to type a really long paragraph within here, it would scale down as opposed to going just across and disappearing at the width right here. I'm going to go ahead and make that right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and click this ellipses button here on the text property, and let's type what we're going to tell the user. Let's say thank you for filling out the data in the form. Please click the finish button to submit your data. Thanks, George. And we can go ahead and hit OK, and you'll see that that our text got displayed here. Now you notice I say the finish button. Now we don't have a finish button yet, and we're actually not going to be creating a new button. What we're going to be doing is telling our page panel in the change method again that when we reach page 2, we're going to go ahead and change the caption of this button right here to, instead of saying next, we're going to want it to say finish. Now we got to also make sure that when we change it back, you know, if we hit the back button, that this is going to switch back to next. So let's go ahead and enter in our page panel change method here, and we're going to add a new if statement right above these two. We're going to say if me.value, again that's if the page panel main.value is equal to 2, then, and let's say bevel next dot caption, and the caption is the text that is displayed on the button, equals finish. Else, so if we're not at the last page or the page number 2, we're going to want it to say bevel next dot caption is equal to next. And let's go ahead and close out that if statement. So now this if statement, this if block right here, we really don't need it anymore, since our value 1 is no longer our maximum value. So we're still going to want to have that finish button enabled. Let me show you what I'm talking about exactly. I'm going to go ahead and run that, save that and run. So we have our first page here, and when I click next, you notice we can't get to that last page, our page value 2, because of that if statement, that second if statement that said if the value is equal to 1, disable this button. So we need to delete that if statement, or that if block, so that we can get to that last page and change this button's captions to finish. So go ahead and quit this, and let's go ahead and remove this statement right here and save that, and let's run it. Let me show you what happens. So now our back button is still disabled, and we still have next as a caption here. We can still click the button. So now both buttons are enabled, so we can still switch back, right? And this gets disabled. But watch what happens to this button when I click it, and it goes to page panel value 2. It should change to say finish. And you'll notice it does. And again, our back button's enabled, and when we hit back, the change method is going to be called in here, and that if statement is going to be called, and this should change back to next, just like that. So you see finish, and we see next. So now we're still not done with this button, and if I click finish, it really doesn't do anything yet. And for right now, we're done with this button for now. Later on, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it send the data to us. So let's go ahead and quit this, and go back to the window main here, the design pane, and I'm going to introduce you to a new concept within RealBasic, and the concept is properties. Now you're familiar with properties over here, and properties within an object are very similar to the properties of a control. Let's go ahead and switch to the window main code view here, and you can do that either clicking on this tab or double clicking on the white space here in the background. And I'm gonna reduce the size of all these drop down arrows right here, of the controls as well. So you see we can hide all these controls, which makes it really nice. So let me explain a property to you. A property is basically a property in a window. Basically, is any data you're going to want to save, you know, that you can call on later. So let's say you had some sort of text, you know, that you wanted to remember, or you wanted your program to remember, that you didn't want to necessarily have on the screen, He just wanted to kind of hold it off on the side, you know, maybe for later on in the program. And basically what we're going to use properties for are to store the data that the user enters right within these fields. So as soon as the user gets to the last page here, they click Finish, what we're going to want to do is collect all this data, right? We're going to want to store it in properties. So each one of these fields is going to have its own property. So we're going to have a first name property, a last name property, a street address property, all of these, even an email, an age, gender, income, comments, everything's going to have its own property. And what that's going to make it really convenient to do is if we want to reference you know, any of this data from outside this window, it makes it really handy because we can just call the properties opposed to getting the text within the control or you know, referencing the data within here. It makes coding a lot easier. So basically as soon as the user hits Finish, we're going to want to read all the data that's in every one of these edit fields, every one of these pop-up menus, these radio buttons. We're going to want to set their appropriate properties. So let's go ahead and switch to the code view of window main, and you'll see this add property button right here next to our comments. And we're going to want to add a property for every one of these. So we can go ahead and count them. We can see 1, 2, 3. There's going to be 13 properties in total. Now this is going to be one property, not two, since they're going to either be male or female. And income, you know, they're only going to have one item selected. So let's go ahead and create 13 properties here. Let's add the first one. And the way property works is, you know, you have the name of the property, which is how you're going to reference it, and then you have a property, you know, a variable type. So it can either be an integer, which is a number, or it could be a string which is some text. It can be a boolean, which is a true or false value. You have lots of options for properties, but in our case we're going to do all strings, since everything is pretty much text here. And I'll explain a little bit more about why we want these to be strings when we get to them. But let's go to our first page here. So let's create properties for every one of these input fields there. So let's do first name as string. Okay, now you see this last edit field right here says equals blank. So we can set a property to be something by default without us setting it somewhere else. And then it's really good practice to set this to something, you know, something that means nothing. And in our case, null means nothing. So if you need to debug this later on, it's really good to have something in there to at least see you know, where an error is occurring or whatever. So in all the properties we create, we're going to set the default to be null, and null basically it just means nothing essentially. So we have first name as null. We're going to add last name as a string, hit return to set that, and then null again there. Now I'm just going to go through and add all these right here. Let's do the city and the state. And our zip. Now you might be thinking, well, a zip code, you know, is a number. Why are we going to have it as a string, as instead of an integer? Well, since we're going to be we're not going to be doing anything mathematical with any of this data. You know, it doesn't serve a purpose to do it as an integer, because we're just going to have to convert it to a string later on anyways. So it's just easier just to set everything as a string in the get-go, you know, just to make it easier on ourselves. So let's add a home phone. You'll notice over here on the left, all our properties are getting added right there. You can see a list of everything that we have. And the little icon that's displayed next to them is the string icon. And if it was an integer, it would look a little bit different as well. Let's do null. Okay, now let's switch to page 2 here, or page 1, value 1. We're going to add all the items that are located on there. We have email, we have age. Now there's a command, there's some hotkeys you can click to, or you can hit on your keyboard that'll add a new property. And on a Mac, that's Command Option P, and that'll add a new property. I'm not sure exactly what it is on Windows. I'm sure it's maybe like Control Alt P or something similar like that. So you can go ahead and just press that, and it'll go ahead and just add a new property just like that. It makes it really easy. So we have gender, income, and the final one is our comments, and we want that to be null as well. So here we have every single one of our inputs on our window main there has a property associated with it, and each one is a string again. Like I said, in a later episode I'll probably get into using integers and doubles and booleans and everything, but for now let's just go ahead and stick with something easy. It's a string. So let's switch back here to our window main, and nothing, again, adding all those properties didn't change anything within the code or within the operation of the program. It simply added the properties to the window, and it doesn't, you may think, well, is it gonna increase the size of the program once I compile it and everything, and the size is really negligible. It's not gonna increase it anything that you'd notice, and it won't slow the execution of your program down at all either. So okay, I'm gonna introduce another new concept here to RealBasic. I know I'm kind of going over a lot today, but a lot of this is really some basic stuff that you really need to know, that's going to help you when you're trying to build even the simplest application. It really makes programming a lot easier. So what I'm going to introduce is the method operator here. You'll notice right there. And a method, we've actually worked with methods before. For example, the action method right here, and the change method within the PagePanel main there. And a method is basically, it's a function. It's anything that you can call to do a series of operations. So, if you wanted to gather, all the data within our window main and set it to each of these properties, you're going to want to do it within a method. Instead of assigning it to, let's say, a button or whatever, you can call a method really within anything. It's basically like like a machine that you can so let's go ahead and switch back to our code view here, and let's add a method. And you'll see our any method that we add ourselves that's not within a control is going to be located here within the methods drop down. And in this case, for this project, we're gonna have two methods. We're gonna have one that's gonna set all our data, or it's gonna read all our data out of our window main and set it to the properties. And then the other method is gonna actually take these properties and format it and actually send it to us. So our first method, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna label that our first method, we're going to go ahead and label it. We're going to name it format data. So basically, we're going to take all the data and format it into these properties. So you don't need to worry about these two fields right here, parameters or return type, for this episode. So you can go ahead and click this disclosure box there, or you can keep it open either way. Let's go ahead and write some code here. Okay, so what we're going to want to do, okay, so here's where naming each of these edit fields gets really handy. You know, naming them something easy. Instead of figuring out, you know, edit field 22 is actually the comments edit field, we can simply, you know, reference it as field comments and then set the data in there to each property. And so this step's going to be really simple. We're just going to basically go down this list right here of properties and associate a property with its edit field. So we can simply do age, and by doing age, you're referencing this property, this string property right here. We can do equals, and now whenever you do the equals operator of a property, you have to be setting it to the same type of variable it is. So you can't set an integer as a string. So you know, you can't set age equal, you know, 34 or whatever. You'd have to add you know, the open quotes there and set it as a string, just like that. And you'll notice the difference between a string and an integer with the color. This is a bit more of a purple, and this is more of a I don't know, what is that, a seafoam green or something similar. But in this case, we're going to reference the text property of the age field on a window main. So this field right here, field age, contains the text property right there, and luckily this text property is a string, so we're not going to have to do any conversion. So we can simply do field age dot text. And so what this is doing is this is reading the string that the user entered within field age, and it's setting it to the property of age right there. So now we're going to just go ahead and go down this list and do the same thing with each one of these. The same for comments. Now this may seem, you know, a bit like overkill, but it's really gonna, you know, first of all, it's really helping us learn, if you're a beginner to programming. It's really good introduction to some of the built-in controls and ideas that RealBasic offers. And secondly, it makes things a lot more organized. Okay, so now on the gender property, we're gonna go ahead and skip that for now, because it's, if you remember, it's those two radio buttons. We're gonna have to do something a little bit special with these. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna hit return and bring that down. Home phone is gonna be the same, and the same with income. Since it was a pop-up menu, I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna do something a little bit special with that as well. Almost done. Alright, so we went through all the fields there, all the edit fields on window main here, and went ahead and assigned these properties to the value that the user entered. Now, this method hasn't been called yet, so really it's never going to get executed since we never call it within our code. So it's just there basically for us to use, but we haven't used it yet. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to assign these to income and gender here. And this, we're going to have to write a couple of if statements here. Let's go ahead and delete income here. Let's start with gender. Now, these radio buttons, if you remember, we checked the value checkbox here, value property, to enable this one, and each of these contains the value property, and they'll never both be selected at the same time, since RealBasic handles that for us, and it deselects one and re-enables the other one. So in order to decide which one the user selected, we're going to need to check which one contains the value. So basically, if female dot value equals true. Now value is going to be a boolean since it has a check mark. If it's checked, it's going to be true. If it's unchecked, it's going to be false. So if female dot value equals true, then the user basically selected female. If male dot value equals true, then the user selected male. So what we're going to want to do is create a little if statement here that says if radio male dot value equals true, then gender, now we're going to set our property there, equals, let's say we're going to set it to a string, so we're going to say male. Else, so basically if male wasn't selected, gender is going to be female. So let's do gender equals female. Let's close out that if statement. So that's pretty basic. So, you know, if the user had one selected, set gender to something. If it wasn't selected, we're going to set it to the opposite. So we have gender done. So now let's move over to the income pop-up menu here. Now we currently don't have any data in there, so let's go ahead and add a little bit. It's really not important what we put in there for this project. You can really kind of make it to whatever you're going to need in your own application. But for now, I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of an example of how to use it. Make sure your income pop-up is selected, and come over here to the under the appearance set of the properties, and go to the initial value property. You'll see this little ellipses button here. Go ahead and select that. Now, the way a pop-up menu works, or at least you add values, you can do it two ways. You can do it one through code, actually adding it, using some code, or you can use this little edit value window here. And this is the first way we're going to do it. It's going to be a little bit easier. Let's go ahead and add a value here. You can do, let's say, below 10,000. Okay. So now if we hit OK, you notice our initial value here popped up right there, and we can hit save and run, and I'll show you exactly what happened. We hit next, you see below 10,000 appeared there, and that's the only one we have to select. So let's go ahead and quit this. So now the way we add more options is if you come back over to this edit value window here, if you hit the return key and drop down to the next line, each new line is going to be associated with a new value. So if you do, let's say 11,000 to 50,000, and do the next one that says, let's say 51,000 to 99,000, and then the last one can be above 100,000. So if we hit OK, you notice we still have our below 10,000 here as a default, but when we run it and hit next, you see all our options there. We can select that one, or we can select that one, and so basically each new line gives us a new value that we can select here. So let's go ahead and close this and save the project, and we're gonna switch back over here to our format data method, and we're gonna go ahead and read the data that's in our pop-up menu right here. So a pop-up menu contains a property called list index, and what list index is the number of the currently selected item. Now you can't see the numbers here, but each row basically is its own number, and we're going to start with 0, much like the page panel here. You know how it starts with 0? We're starting with 0 here, and this will be 0, this will be 1, this will be 2, and this will be 3. So basically if pop income here is equal to list index 3, then the user selected above 100,000. If it's equal to list index 1, then the user selected 11,000 to 50,000. If it's list index 0, then they selected below 10,000. So we're going to use that to determine what the user selected. So let's create a new if block here that says if pop income dot list index equals 0, then we're going to set So we're going to make an if statement here that says if PopIncome dot list index is equal to 0, then let's set our income equal to below 10,000. So basically we're going to go through that list that we just created and just assign it accordingly. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of a variation to our if block here. Now usually you're used to the else operator, but if statements also contain an else if operator. So basically you can call sort of a separate if statement within this one. So you can say else if PopIncome.listIndex equals 1, then income equals let's see, what was it, 10,000 to, I don't even remember, what did we set it to? Here, I'll just copy this right here. We have 11,000 to 50,000. Okay, now we're going to use else if again to do the next number. PopIncome.listIndex equals 2, then income equals 51,000 through 99,000, and our last one, else if PopIncome.listIndex equals 3, then income equals above 100,000. And remember that income is a string, so that's why I'm setting these as strings using these quotes as opposed to integers, because you have to set it to whatever type of variable it is. And let's go ahead and close the if block with an end if. So now let me walk you through this process right here. We can go ahead and delete this. So as soon as our code execution gets to this, you know, the program reads if PopIncomeListIndex equals 0. So if the user selected the first one, then we set income to below 10,000. And if that's the case, if we reach this inside block right here, then it skips over the rest of these and just goes to the end if and finishes execution. But if this case was false, so if it never even, you know, if list index was not equal to 0, it never gets here. It goes to the next if block. So then it checks this one. And if if list index was equal to 1, then it'll go here. If that's not the case, it'll keep going to the next one, keep going to the next one. If it never reaches any of them, it'll just end if and, you know, break out of the if statement. But that'll never be the case. We'll always, you know, reach one of these. So we can go ahead and save that and run it just to make sure everything looks okay. And again, we still don't have any execution. We never are calling that format data function or format data method. So it really doesn't do anything yet. But you can see we can still select this. So right now list index would be 1. Now if I select this, list index would be 0. If I select this, list index would be 3. Okay, let's go ahead and quit this. And let's go ahead and work on this up-down arrow here. So by default, let's have 0 in the age here. Since the up-down arrow, we're going to want to increment or decrement whatever the value is in here. So let's select age here and come over here to the text property and click here and put in 0 and hit return. So now 0 gets set right in there, and you'll notice it appears, and when we run the program it'll still be displayed. But these buttons still don't do anything yet. It doesn't automatically associate with this edit field. So we're going to have to write some code that's going to take this value and increment it, much like we did with these buttons here for the page panel. So go ahead and double click on this up down arrow here, and you'll notice that we got taken to the down method of the up down arrow, and you'll see that it has a down method, and right here it has an up method. So we have our up method, and we have our down method. So for our down method, we're going to want to reference the value that's in here. So field age dot text, and we're going to want to decrement that by 1, right? So the first thing we're going to want to do is write some code that's going to convert our our text within field age to an integer, and then we're going to want to decrement that integer by 1. So to do that, RealBasic offers the val function. And what val does is, if you pass val a string that's a number, it will convert the string to an integer that you can work with, and perform mathematical operations on. So what we're going to want to do is use this val operator, and you notice we do val and then open parentheses. And then what val expects, if you look at the bottom of the window here, you'll see it expects a string. So luckily our field age .text value or property is a string. So what we can do is pass field age .text, and then we can do -1. Right, so that'll decrement the value of field age.text to -1. So if field age contained, let's say 10, and you did -1, it'd just be 9, obviously. So now this operation right here is going to return something. So we need to set this to something. So what we're going to do is set this to the current field age.text. So basically we're going to perform this operation and then replace field age.text with the new decremented value. However, field age.text requires a string to be passed. So let's do this. Field age.text equals. Now we can't do this because again, like I was saying, it requires a string, and I'll show you what happens whenever we try to run this. RealBasic is going to tell us that it's an inappropriate type. You'll see it says type mismatch error, expect string, but it got a double, and double is basically just a longer integer. And it shows us where our error is. So let's go ahead and double click on this, and it'll take us right to where our error is, and it'll put a little bug icon here right next to where our bug is, and we can close this error box up there. So in order to fix this problem, we're going to use, just like the val operator, we can use a str or a string operator to convert an integer or a double or a float or anything back over to a string. So we're going to wrap this whole section of code right here in the string operator. So we're going to open parentheses there and go all the way to the end and close the parentheses. So if you work from your way inside out, it's going to take basically the text that's within field age, convert it to a value, so convert it to an integer, subtract it by 1, and then reconvert it to a string, and then set that string back to field age.text. So let me show you basically what that just did. I'm going to save it and run it, and let's go ahead and go to that page. So right now we're at 0. We're going to write a little bit of code in just a second to kind of do a check for this, but you'll notice it's decrementing us by 1 every time as soon as I click the down arrow. Now we don't have any code for the up arrow yet, so we're just going to be able to decrement. So let's go ahead and quit this, and let's put an if statement in here that's going to check if our value is equal to 1. So let's and if it is equal to 1, or if it is equal to 0, then we're not going to want to decrement the value at all. We want 0 to be our minimum value. So let's do if field age.text. Now RealBasic offers a greater than and a less than operator, and that's going to be these greater than sign or less than sign. And the way so what we're going to do is we're going to do if field age.text is So we're going to write an if statement here, basically checking if field age, the value of field age is greater than, or if it's equal to 0, then we're not going to want to decrement it anymore. However, if it's not equal to 0, then we're going to want to be able to decrement it. So now, since we're going to be using the equal to 0 operator, we can't do that with the string. We're going to have to use the same function, the val function here, to convert it to an integer or a double. So we're going to do field age.text is equal to 0. Then we're going to want to basically do nothing in this case, else, and then that's where this decrement comes in, and then we can close this out. So now in here, when we're doing nothing, I like to usually put a comment in here that says do nothing. So we know that basically we're skipping over this. So to recap on this, we're checking the value of field age. If it's equal to 0, we don't want to be able to decrement anymore. So when the user clicks the down arrow, we want basically nothing to happen. Otherwise, if it's not equal to 0, we want the user to still be able to decrement that. So right now, if we run the program and hit the down arrow, nothing's going to happen because the initial value is at 0. So let's switch over to the up method here, and let's go ahead and let's copy this code right here, this little text, and let's copy that. Let's go ahead and paste it in here. So instead of decrementing the value by 1, we can go ahead and just change this to a plus sign. So again, we're getting the text that's within field age, changing it to a value, incrementing it by 1, changing it back to a string, and then setting it to fieldAge.text. Let's go ahead and save that and run it, and I'll show you exactly what we just did. So now we changed the up method and the down method. So right now it's at 0, so we shouldn't be able to decrement it, and that's right. Our if statement is protecting us, and we're hitting that do nothing comment, so basically nothing's happening. But if we hit the up button, we're getting incremented. So now when I hit the down button, it should skip over that do nothing section since it's not equal to 0 and decrement us back down. So you see that works just right, just like we need it to. Alright, so that works great. Our pop-up menu works great. Our booleans here work great. Or our radio buttons here work great. So we can go ahead and quit this and switch back over to our format data method. So we already have our age check here that reads our field age.text. So we have basically our age being set since it was just a string. We don't have to do any sort of conversion or anything like that. So the next step we want to do, now that we have our format data method, is we're going to create a send data method that's basically going to take all this data and send it to us in an email, actually. So we're going to add a new method here. We're going to name it send data, and again, we're not going to have anything in parameters or return type. Alright, so the first thing to do within our send data method, we're going to want to create a couple of variables here. And what a variable is, it's very similar to a property, but it's only its scope is basically only within this method here. And what the scope means is the program can only see it within this method. So if I create a variable or a property within this method, I can't call it within format data. I can only call it within send data. And the way we create a new variable within a method is using this dim operator, and basically dim just means to create a new variable. And then the syntax for creating a variable is dim and then the variable name. In our case, we're going to set stir body, and I'm doing str because we're going to be creating a string. And then the next thing to do would be put as, and then the type of variable we're creating, and in this case we're doing a string. So basically this line says create a new string named stir body. So basically if one of these was named stir body, it would be the same thing. Now we're going to want to create two strings, and an easy way to do that instead of creating this line twice is simply putting a comma right after this and putting the other name of the other variable. We're going to want to do stir subject, and we can save that. And then now the next thing we're going to do, we're going to create another string, but we're going to set this string up here in the dim line instead of setting it down in the code. So for that we're going to need to create a new line for that. I'm going to do dim cr, and what I'm doing cr for is a carriage return, or basically a new line. So I'm going to, in the send data method, we're going to be formatting all our properties here. We're going to be reading all our properties and creating basically one large string containing all these properties to email to ourselves. So we're going to do this as a string, and then here's the difference between the one above it, is that we're going to use an equal sign, and then we can open up our quotes here and set this to something, to anything we want. Now here's where it's going to get a little bit complicated. I'm going to tell you about a string here. You really don't need to worry about too much what it means. It's just for basically email programs to be able to read a new line. And that code it is, it's the %, and then the number 0, and then the letter capital A. And that's not a RealBasic thing. This is like an email application thing, so you don't really need to worry too much about that. So we can go ahead and skip a couple of lines down, and this is the part where we're gonna start compiling all our data together into one kind of big clump. The first thing we want to do is let's set our subject of our email. So we're going to do stir subject equals, and let's see, we can set it to, I'm going to go ahead and do it to episode 2 submission form. And you can set this to whatever you want. It doesn't have to be this. It doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and skip down a couple lines. And remember, stir subject was a string, so I set it to a string right here. And so now we're gonna have a little bit more repetition here. We're gonna go through each one of these properties and add it to string body here, or stir body. It's gonna get a little bit tricky here. You're gonna have to kind of follow along in your head with what's going on in the code. So the first thing we want to do, we're going to do stir body equals, and the way I'm going to present it in the email, you can kind of ignore this what I'm typing here, you don't need to type this, but I'm thinking the email is going to be something like this, where you have first name and the user enters in their, and then it's displayed as their first name, and then you have last name, and then you have email, etc. All the data basically displayed like this within an email to you or to whoever the program's going to send it to. And the tricky part is getting it to jump to a new line like this, and that's what this carriage return is here for. Otherwise, it's gonna get all kind of jumbled up like that, and it's gonna show up in the email like this. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of our properties, and we're going to set string body to each of these properties. So the first one we're going to do first name. So in order to display that text that said first name like this with a little colon there and a space, we're going to do equals open quotes first name colon. Make sure you have that space there, because it's gonna look a little bit crunched up if you don't. Now you can set it to more than one thing at a time, so we can use a plus operator, and then here's where we reference our first name string right here. So we can do first name, and then plus, and then CR, our carriage return. So we're gonna have first name, and then the first name that the user entered, plus, and then a return. So we're gonna jump to the new line basically. So now we have that. So we're gonna do our last name now. So instead of just jumping straight to last name, we have to if we just do, look, let me show. If we just do this, last name plus carriage return, it's going to replace string body with this. It's not going to add it onto the back of this. So in order to add it onto the back of this or append it, we're going to need to do string body plus all this. So basically it takes the data we've already entered into string body and adds this onto the end of it. And so we're going to want to do this for everything that we have. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste these in there. It may be a little bit easier. You can do the same thing. Let's see, this one was going to be street address. This next one we can set it to city. This next one, state. And zip code. And let's see, what was after zip code? We have a home phone. And then our work phone. And our, let's see, gender. Now remember, we had gender set in our format data section, or our format data method, so we can simply reference it as a string here. That's why we made that separate method here, so we didn't have to do all this code within this one send data method here. Income, and again we also set income in the other one, in the other method. And we have comments. And I believe we set comments in here. Yeah, we set comments right there. Okay. So right now we have all this data formatted, so it's going to look, it's going to have first name, and then display the first name, skip to new lines, last name, skip to new line, email, new line, and all that. Now the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to have, this data right here and its own little block, and then I want to skip down. I want a blank line between work phone and gender. So in order to do that, we're going to have two carriage returns here. So we're going to jump one line, and then we're going to jump one more line. So if we have it, if it's displayed like this, like home phone, we're going to have one carriage return and then a second carriage return, and then show, the gender right there. So you just add two carriage returns there, and it'll go ahead and just make that line. And I'm going to do the same thing at comments as well. So we can do that. Okay, so skip down a few lines here. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, and this is really again, it has to do a lot with an email program and not simply RealBasic. But apparently I did a little bit of research online, and some email programs don't like it when you have spaces in your subject or your body here. So we're going to have to replace our spaces with the hexadecimal value for a space, which is %20. So RealBasic makes it real easy to do that. It has lots of built-in functions for it. So we can go ahead and do that to both our subject and our body. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to do string subject equals, and RealBasic offers a replace all function. And now if you look at the bottom again, you'll see it requires a source string, a substring, and a replacement string. Now what the source string is what string we're going to be doing the work in, the replacement in. Our substring is going to be what string we're going to be replacing. So if we're looking for spaces, we simply do open quote space close quote. And then our replacement string is going to be what we're going to replace the substring with. So in this case we're going to do string subject comma, since next we're going to do our substring. So we're going to do open quotes and close quotes. Now you see there's a little space right here. So basically the replace all function is going to be looking for any spaces, and then it's going to replace it with open quotes %20 close quotes. And again, really don't worry about this %20. Don't let it confuse you. You're rarely going to ever do it within RealBasic. It's just for this program we're doing right now. We're going to have to do it in order to make most of the mail programs function the way we want it to. So replace all is going to return a string, so we're setting string subject to our replaced value there. And if you notice, here we have string subject as episode space 2 space submission space form. And what this replace all is going to do is going to delete these spaces and replace it with a %20 like that. And email programs are going to know what to do with that. You don't really need to worry about it. You'll probably never see it. So we're going to go to the next line here and go to string body equals, and we're going to do the exact same thing here. We can actually just copy this line and replace string subject here with string body and hit save. So now RealBasic has gone through, these two functions have gone through all this text we formatted up here and replaced all the spaces with this %20 sign. So now this is where the part where we are going to actually mail this data to ourselves. So we're going to allow the user to submit it to us. So RealBasic offers a function named showURL. And if you wanted the user to be redirected to a website or if you had a website, there was a button you wanted to link to a certain website or whatever, you could assign it the show URL function, and it would actually redirect the user to that website. But in our case, the HTML language offers a mail to syntax, and what the mail to syntax does is opens up the user's default emailing application and allows users to send an email. And there's certain parameters you can pass to the mail to function or mail to parameter that will automatically format the subject and the body of their email client. And that's the whole reason that we set this string subject and string body, is that we're going to automatically set mail to add all this data into it. So all the user simply has to do is hit send, and it'll automatically get sent to us. So the show URL function or method requires a string to be passed. In our case, we're going to open up the string, or open up the quotes here, and type mail to, and put a colon. And the mail to syntax is like this. If you do mail to, it requires an email address here, and that's going to be the email address that you're sending it to. And then it requires the well, it really only requires the email address, but it allows for you to put in a subject and then a body. So we're going to be formatting it just like that. So the first thing we're going to do, in my case, we're going to do George at RealBasic.tv. So if I were to close it at this, as soon as the user hit show URL, or as soon as the user or the code executed show URL, a new email would pop up with this in the mail to field of their email client. But we still want to format the subject and the body. So in order to do that, you put a question mark there, and the question mark is just a delimiter to tell the program that we're going on to the next part of the parameter. And then we're going to do subject equals, and we're going to close quotes on this part, because now we need to reference this line of code right here, or this string. So we're going to do plus. We're going to go right down here and do plus, and go to string subject. Now the reason we close the quotes is if we did it right here within the quotes, it would simply print string subject. It wouldn't print out this line, it would just print out the word string subject. So we're going to want to, instead of referencing it as a string, we're going to reference the string within this variable. Now we're going to add again onto the end of that. We're going to use an and symbol body. An and symbol is a lot like this question mark here. It's just a delimiter to tell the email program that we're going on to the next section. And then equals, and then close the quotes, and then again another plus sign, and then we're going to do string body. And you can just delete this section right here. So now make sure you save your work. So now the show URL function here, it's sending a mail to George at RealBasic.tv with the subject, string subject, and in this case episode 2 submission form, and the body, string body, which is all this data right here. We retrieve the data with format data, we set it all in here, and that's going to be placed in the body of the email message. So now all the user has to do is hit the finish button, and a new email is going to pop up with all this data created inside of it, and all I had to do is hit the send button. I'm going to go ahead and show you how that works now. So now if I do George, and I'm just putting in some random data in here. Mail, let's say here. Wow, great program. And you hit the next. So you've got taken to the thank you pane of the page panel. We can just hit the finish button, and as soon as the finish button gets pushed, we're going to want that method to be called. Actually, we didn't do that yet. So what we're going to want to do here is as soon as the user hits that finish button, we're going to want format data to be called, right? And then as soon as format data is completed, we're going to want send data to be called. So at the end of format data here, we can actually reference this other method right at the end of this. So we can just type in send data, and generally you put the open and close parentheses to denote that it's a function. And so as soon as it gets done formatting all this text in here, it's going to go ahead and switch over to the send data, complete all this, and pop up our new mail message. So we can save that, and let's switch back over to window main and double click our next button here. Or I'm sorry, actually our change method within so we're going to want to go ahead and go ahead and go to our window main here and double click our next button. And right above here we're going to create a new if statement that says if, and again we're going to use the me operator, and this is going to reference itself. It's going to reference the bevel next button, me.text, or I'm sorry, me.caption equals finish, then, and this is where we're going to want to run our methods that we created. So we're going to want to do format data else. So otherwise the caption wasn't finished, so the user wasn't finished yet, it still was at next. We're going to want to increment the page panel. So we can hit save here. So now when the user gets to the last page, our page panel changes this caption right here to finish, right? Then when the user is done and everything, he sees it, they see the thank you method, or they see the thank you data right here. It says please click the finish button. This is going to say finish. As soon as they click finish, this code is going to get called, and it's going to say if me.caption equals finish, then format data, and then that's where all the data gets compiled and the new email gets sent. So let's go ahead and save this and run it, and I'll show you exactly how that works. Let's put in some random data here. Okay, hit the next button, and you notice I hit the next button and the caption wasn't finished, or wasn't finished, so it just incremented the page panel. So we can go ahead and put an email here, and this all works. Okay, we can just change this to whatever we want it to be. We can change this to, what a great program. Okay, and we hit next. Now this changed to finish. So now as soon as I click this, that format data method is going to be called, and all the data is going to be compiled into the properties. And then the send data method is going to be called right at the end of that, and the data is going to be formatted into the string subject and string body, and a new email is going to be compiled, and my email application is going to automatically open up, and a new email is going to be created containing all the data. And you notice there's everything we typed in. You notice episode 2 submission form, and you'll see that our to field is already labeled right there, George at RealBasic.tv, and all our data is contained right there. And you'll see how everything's on a new line, and that's what we had to do with the that weird string, the carriage return string. That basically made this possible. Otherwise, all this would have just been one jumbled mess. So we'll go ahead and close your email program. Now the last thing we want to do before we'll be done with this project, as soon as the user clicks finish, it's going to automatically open up the email program, but we're going to want this program to close. Now you may want it to close, you may not want it to close. In this case, we're going to go ahead and make it quit itself. So you can go ahead and quit this right here, and locate the finish, or click the next button here. So after we run format data here, basically the way a method works is, the format data is called, we can go down here, all this is executed, send data is called, all this is executed. So as soon as it gets to the end of this, it jumps way back up here to the next operation. So in our case, we're going to want to simply do quit, and quit just quits our program. So we can hit save and run. And now I'm going to show you why, if you remember whenever we were first creating our properties, we set everything to null. And the user, if they don't put anything in there, it'll actually place null instead of a blank. So we can hit next. As soon as I hit finish, this is going to quit, and our email application is going to open up, and as soon as our new email is created, this thing is going to quit itself. Yep, see, and we have blanks all right here, just like we had hoped for. So you see, we wrote a pretty detailed application that covers a lot of the basics and a lot of actually pretty advanced features of RealBasic, and you can take a lot of the stuff you learned today and kind of play around with it and build basically any type of application. Now you know how to kind of create an email using RealBasic. You can even open up a browser window using the show URL function. We kind of grazed over methods. We didn't really go too far into them. Next episode we'll be covering a lot more detail, but I think this is a great start if you're a beginner in RealBasic, and even if you're pretty intermediate, there's probably some stuff in here that you didn't know. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or get on the forums, sign up, register at the site. Please do. Please, discuss your ideas. Give me your show ideas. If you have any projects you're working on, please feel free to, submit them in the forums. Talk about it. We're trying to start a community here, so let's try and get that going. For RBTV, I'm your host, George Bonish. Thanks for watching.